presentation. It's being recorded. No, just kidding. A little bit about this presentation. Hedgie and I are not PhDs or psychiatrists, so offer us grace. We are just like you. We are policy wonks and defenders and justice advocates that have been bothered by seeing overmedication and misdiagnosis and have been studying structural racism and its impact on the court system. And we wanted to have this conversation with all of you. And this practical guide is a jumping off point. Our goal and our hope is that we're going to continue to have these conversations, that you are going to come back to us with motions that you have tried, with questions that you have, with roadblocks that you're having, so that we can continue to start pulling down all of these structures of systemic racism that we see in our courts every single day. So with that, we are going to get into it. All right, so let me request access. And let's do it. All right, so first things first, we're going to talk about roadmaps and what we're going to cover today. So we're going to do a brief recap on Dr. Irwin's training on the key takeaways that we saw from that training that we want everybody to be reminded of as we start to have this conversation and roll our sleeves up and dig in. We're going to talk about definitions so that we're all on the same page when we're going through the research and going through the studies. And then Hedgie's going to walk us through ADHD versus ODD and conduct disorder diagnosis and explaining the disparities around those. We're going to talk about systemic racism, and then we're going to get into it. We're going to talk litigation tools. We're going to talk about what we can use to get these arguments happening as early as tomorrow. And then we'll close out with enough time for you to ask questions of Hedgie and I, and then also Dr. Irwin. So first things first, we want to know what brought you to the discussion here today. So in the chat, let us know, are these arguments that you've tried and had success? Are these arguments that you've tried and haven't worked? Are you just curious about the information? Are you just angst and ridden and angry like Hedgie and I, and you want to start making these arguments? What brought you to today's discussion? So I'm going to give it a couple minutes and then we'll see what comes in the chat, why it is that everybody joined us here today. So just type right in the chat what prompted you to come to today's training. Awesome. Love it. More info, how to make the arguments, interested in the topic. Great. Interested in the line between kids not getting the treatment, over medication, more info. Okay. Educate yourself on the topic. Okay, great. So this is really, really helpful for us to think about where the community is at. Awesome. Love it. More information. Okay. All right. Great. Great. All right. So just keep populating those as we get into this discussion. So these were the things that Hedgie and I, these really jumped out to us from Dr. Irwin's training, right? One is that we play a critical role as defenders, right? We know that. We play a critical role in changing the practice of over-medication and interrupting misdiagnosis. What we also know is that disparities exist, right? That Black, Native, Indigenous, Latino, and Latina youth that are involved are over-medicated. We also will talk a little bit, and Dr. Irwin talked a lot about the causes of over-medication. And what he really, one of the key takeaways for me was he talks about how there's a mislabeling of typical expected emotions as psychopathology. And then one of my favorite things from that training is that he gave us a list of red flags that we should be looking for and that should give us pause, things that we should be concerned about if we see with our clients, right? So medication cocktails, 2 and 3 medications, adding medications to treat side effects, off-label use of psychotropics. So also this handout was circulated. If you need it, let us know, but that's in the practical guide as well. It gives you just some things to be concerned about. And if you see these in your practice, then these are things that should give you pause and you want to look a little bit deeper. So first things first, we like to get started with our definitions so that we're all talking the same language, right? And this one comes from the Aspen Institute. There's lots of definitions out there. This is the one that we've settled on when we have these conversations around structural racism. So structural racism is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. It's allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure, adapt over time. What we don't mean by structural racism. So when we're talking about structural racism, we're talking about an entire system. So that means that even if individual racism is absent, it's just a systemic racism and structural racism can still be present. We also talk a lot, and Chris Henning is with us today, talks a lot about implicit racial bias, right? And that's not something that we should be ignoring. We, of course, want to be looking at our own implicit racial bias. Many of the studies that we'll talk about today and the research talks about other providers and teachers and implicit racial bias. So we need to be hyper aware of our own implicit racial bias and being able to sort out when other individuals and players in the system are coming with implicit racial bias. What also happens is as we begin to sort of unpack and recognize our own implicit racial bias, it puts us in a better position to be able to see the system of systemic racism that exists in the court system. So one of the other things that we also talk a lot about is that implicit racial bias and structural racism feed into each other and allow the other to continue. And it's sort of this endless cycle where you have priming associations and assumptions that feeds into history, policies, and practices, which then feeds into inequitable outcomes and racial disparities, which then feeds back into priming associations and assumptions. And so they reinforce each other. And so we need to be diligent to make sure that we're working to dismantle systemic racism, because even if implicit bias is removed, systemic racism continues. So this is a legacy of the period of enslavement in this country. And what we see is that redlining, unequal medical care, mass incarceration, and police violence, they all overlap when we talk about a period of enslavement in this country. And these are all things that then lead to overmedication and misdiagnosis. And we're going to unpack how that happens throughout the course of this hour.
All right. Okay. So with all of that foundational information on structural racism and implicit bias, now we're going to take a look at the landscape of health disparities. And as KK mentioned, we're going to focus specifically on the diagnostic disparities around ADHD versus ODD, or oppositional defiant disorder, and conduct disorder. But before we dive into this, we're going to do a quick little exercise. We're going to do a chat waterfall. So think of one common symptom of ADHD that you've seen in your clients or elsewhere, and have it ready in the chat, but don't click enter yet. We're going to click enter together as a group so we can have a waterfall of responses. So just think of one common symptom of ADHD that you've seen within your client population or that you've heard of. Have it ready, and we'll give everyone a couple seconds and we'll see what comes in. So have it queued up in the chat, one common symptom of ADHD. We'll give everyone like 3 more seconds. Oh, okay. We can click enter now. I see that. Yeah, quick to get frustrated. Oh my gosh. Okay, hyperarousal, cannot maintain focus, impulsivity, easily distracted, unable to concentrate, disorganized, difficulty focusing, not concentrating, distraction, squirming. Okay, great. Okay, so now let's do the same exact thing, but for ODD and conduct disorder. So think of one common symptom of ODD or conduct disorder that you've seen in your clients, and have it queued up in the chat. We'll give everyone like 3 seconds. You guys are pros at the chat waterfall. I love it. And then let's see what we get. So common symptom of ODD and CD. And let's click enter. Oh my gosh, okay, there's some interrupting, outburst, not following rules, hyperarousal, tantrums, anger, rage. NA, but those diagnosed are almost always Black. Yes, we're absolutely going to get into that. Disrespect authority and patient outbursts. Okay, awesome. Now, one last thing. Let's do the same exact thing, but for trauma. What's one common manifestation of trauma or a symptom of trauma that you've seen in your client base? We'll give everyone a couple seconds to get queued up in the chat, but you guys are pros at this point. And then let's see what the responses are. Okay, yeah, you can click enter now. Yeah, hyperarousal anger, withdrawal, distrust, hyperarousal anxiety, irritability, sadness, trouble regulating emotions, anxiety. Okay, great, great, great. Social and emotional dysregulation, attentive. Okay, all right. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for indulging us in this quick little exercise. The point of this exercise is really to show, and as you guys have all seen through our chat waterfall, right, that there were some significant overlaps in symptomologies across ADHD, ODD, CD, and trauma. And we're going to unpack what that means and the implications of all of that a little bit further in the next couple of slides. So we thank you for your participation. Okay, so first off, let's take a look at ADHD versus ODD. Now, to begin with, the evaluation of these symptoms, they rely on the subjective interpretation and contextualization of a child's behavior by a clinician, right? But we know from studies that clinicians are subject to the same types of implicit biases that we all carry. And that implicit biases certainly play a role in diagnosis. So the significance of this is that depending on the diagnosis that's given to a child, that diagnosis then can limit a child's access to necessary medication, treatment, and other services. So just to play this out, if a young person is exhibiting some of these overlapping symptoms and is incorrectly diagnosed with ODD as opposed to ADHD, then that misdiagnosis can lead to important treatment implications for that youth, right? It deprives that youth of necessary ADHD focused treatment and medication. Or alternatively, the other way this can play out is if a child is exhibiting normative behavior that's a result of adolescence and brain development, but is misidentified and psychopathologized as exhibiting ADHD or worse, ODD, then we're, of course, wholesale subjecting that child to unnecessary medication and treatment in that scenario as well. But not only that, there's also a significant difference in the social stigma that's associated with the ODD label. Right. So first off, ADHD is classified as a neurodevelopmental disorder. It's considered to have neurodevelopmental origins, whereas ODD and CD is classified in the DSM-5 as a disruptive behavior disorder. So first and foremost, by labeling a young person as quote, oppositional and defiant, behaviors that are already loaded with a negative connotation, it not only leads a young person to internalize those labels and harbor low self-esteem due to those labels, but it also leads to youth with that ODD label as being less likely to be evaluated for other social and psychiatric conditions that may otherwise explain their behavior. So this labeling or mislabeling can lead to a cycle of harm that frankly, everyone in this virtual space probably is well too aware, right? That we know that youth diagnosed with ODD and CD are less likely to stay in school, and they're more likely to be involved in the juvenile legal system, which is really why KK and I got really interested in looking into what was at play with this ODD diagnosis as well. And of course, all of this, like everything we just talked about, has a disproportionate impact on Black, Native, Indigenous, and Latina youth. Now, the other important layer to all of this, and we kind of touched on this with the first exercise, is that there is also a significant overlap with the diagnostic criteria of ODD and ADHD with trauma and PTSD. So just as an example, and you guys had noted a lot of this in the exercise as well, but emotional reactivity, anger, and irritability, they're all normative experiences and normative responses to adverse experiences and trauma. But the diagnostic criteria for ODD, it actually directs clinicians to disregard potential causal factors when determining that diagnosis. And what that does is that it actually creates a pathway for youth who experience trauma to be diagnosed with ODD. And what that means is that we are then now in the business of actively reframing a young person's experience with trauma as an issue with that young person's behavior and self-control. And again, here we know that Black, Native, Indigenous, and Latina youth, they are all subject to higher levels of toxic stress as a result of systemic inequities and structural racism, right? Think poverty, exposure to violence, discrimination, racism, and the list goes on. So what we're doing with this ODD pathway is we're effectively blame shifting. We are pathologizing trauma responses and normative responses to trauma and adverse experiences. And we're blaming that young person for their behavior while we're evading the structural roots and causes of their trauma and lived experiences. So what's clear from all of this is that we cannot have this discussion around diagnostic disparities and over-medication without understanding the structural roots that are at play. And this ACE tree is a really helpful visual reminder of this. So the roots of structural racism, they manifest through the branches and trees of adverse childhood experiences that then can manifest into a child's reactive behavior, right? That then gets stigmatized through the labeling or the mislabeling of ODD that then pushes them deeper into the juvenile carceral system and so forth. And the reality is, and we know this from studies, is that this labeling or mislabeling of ODD, it actually impacts Black and Latina youth at far higher rates than white youth. So first, studies have shown that beginning as early as kindergarten, Black and Latina youth are less likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than white children, despite showing more symptoms of ADHD than the white children who were diagnosed. But second, studies also reveal that in addition to the Black and Latina youth being less likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, they are more likely to be diagnosed with a disruptive behavior disorder, even in instances where ADHD was likely indicated. In fact, Black youth are 2.5 times more likely to be diagnosed with a conduct disorder, which is a more severe form of ODD than ADHD. And what this all signals is that Black youth are not only being deprived of necessary ADHD medication when applicable, but they're also now unnecessarily subject to the off-label use of antipsychotics to control and regulate their behavior that's now being labeled as ODD. And just to tease that point out a little bit further, currently, there is no FDA-approved medication for the treatment of ODD and CD. So the first line of treatment that's considered most effective is actually psychotherapy. But we know from studies that the off-label use of antipsychotics has become routine to manage the symptoms of ODD and CD, despite there being insufficient evidence on the effectiveness of antipsychotics for the treatment of ODD and CD. In fact, the use of antipsychotics is only to control symptoms. It's not to quote unquote cure ODD or CD. What we also know is that Black patients are overprescribed antipsychotics in our country compared to white patients. And this is rooted in our country's history of psychopathologizing Black activists in the mid-1900s with schizophrenia, which then opened the door to utilize antipsychotics as a form of social control against Black communities engaging in these acts of rebellion and resistance towards the oppressive forces that were waged against them. So on that note, we are now going to take a deeper dive into some of these structural roots at play that contribute to misdiagnosis and over medication. And we're going to examine three main factors. So first, we're going to talk about the abuse of medicine and science to justify racial inferiority and institutionalized oppression during the period of enslavement. Two, we're going to talk about the implicit biases of healthcare providers and educators that are still pervasive today. And three, we're going to talk about the wealth gap That was a result of governmental policies that were designed to strip Black Americans of building and acquiring wealth that then implicates access to insurance and type of insurance, which all of which play a role in diagnosis in health and medication. So first, with the use of, quote, science and medicine during the period of enslavement. So in our country's history, it is an undisputed fact that the field of medicine and science were used to justify the continued enslavement of Black people in America. So there were many well-respected physicians and scientists who were actually keen on proving that there were biological and physical distinctions between Black and white individuals. And as a result, they conducted a series of torturous experiments on enslaved men and women. Now, just one example of this, and unfortunately, there really are too many examples to count, is that back in the 1820s, a well-respected physician who also was a wealthy plantation owner conducted a series of painful experiments on enslaved men to try to prove that they had thicker skin and thus a higher pain tolerance than white people. Now, this fallacy at that time was legitimized in medical journals. It supported racist ideologies and oppressive public policies. But importantly, it perpetuated this myth that Black people have a higher pain tolerance than white people that is actually still pervasive in medicine today. Now, as an example, the American Medical Association conducted a study, and they found that Black patients from like little tiny babies to the elderly, all across the board, all received inadequate pain management compared to their white counterparts. Now, Black patients were less likely to receive pain medication. And even when they did, it was at a lower dose, despite having higher pain scores than white patients. And separately, another study found that a substantial number of medical students and residents still believed that Black patients had a higher pain tolerance and a higher pain threshold than white patients, leading to less accurate and inadequate treatment recommendations for Black patients. And while these fallacies around biological and physiological differences were percolating, the field of psychiatry was also being weaponized to perpetuate oppression and social control. Now, just one example is in the 1960s and 1970s, as the civil rights movement was well underway, we saw a concerted effort in our country to psychopathologize the acts of rebellion and resistance by Black activists as a form of psychosis under schizophrenia, which, by the way, before this time, if you all recall, was predominantly a diagnosis that was given to white women, right? Like, think the schizoaffective housewife of the 1940s. But by labeling these acts of protest as a form of psychosis, it opened the door for the use of antipsychotics, which also conveniently happened to have been discovered around this time, to be used as a form of chemical or mental restraint on Black activists. And this disparity in the overmedication of Black patients with antipsychotics is still persistent in medicine and psychiatry today. I mean, just think about our own client population, right? Like, we often see the use of antipsychotics to regulate or control a young person's behavior that, frankly, the quote system does not like or fails to recognize as a symptom of trauma.
So we've been going through this information fairly quickly. And really the goal is to get us to the point where we can begin to have a conversation about how we're going to use this in court. But Hedgie is going to walk you through this amazing resource guide that you'll have. So if you're trying to take notes really quickly or worried that you're not going to have the research, you will. So we're just getting through all of the information that we found to share with you in order to get to the point where we can begin to have the conversation about how we begin to use this in court. So going into the second piece and pot of information that Hedgie talked about, implicit bias of healthcare professionals and educators, providers, just like all of us, have implicit racial bias. And that feeds into how Black and African-American patients are serviced. And what we have found is that there are studies that reveal that providers have used this implicit bias, and that affects their diagnosis and treatment. And that Black patients receive less information about their treatment and are more likely to receive inappropriate treatment referrals and are more misdiagnosed than their white counterparts. So when we talk about misdiagnosis or overdiagnosis, it becomes really difficult when we're talking about mental health, because unlike other diagnoses, there's not necessarily going to be a physical component that goes with it. And so when we're talking about overdiagnosis, we have to really look at the criteria and see how the diagnosis was given, and to see whether or not a clinician and whether or not the person performing or giving the diagnosis adhered to all of the regimen when making that diagnosis. What also becomes problematic is when we talk about children as opposed to adults. Children, there's a number of sources of information. And one of those main sources of information is how our clients are doing in school. And we're going to talk about some of the research, and this will be in your guide as well, about what happens with teachers and their own IRB and how Black students are treated in school settings. So we have a situation in which clinicians are relying on information many times with those of us who worked in dually and system involved youth, potentially programs, residential centers, detention centers, or foster care parents, or schools and teachers are giving information to the person making the diagnosis about how the youth is acting. And that also is going to be tinged with potentially IRB. What we also find is that there's two different issues, right? So one is the information that's coming in. The other thing is how they take into account the feelings that the youth is reporting and what they need, what they believe need to be addressed. And one of the experts that we consulted with prior to today was talking about the fact that particularly in residential settings, in foster care settings, and in detention center settings, that many times doctors are prescribing medications with the fear that behavior might occur and not in response to behavior that they actually are seeing. The other thing is something called the halo effect. With what are you focused on? Are you thinking about the fact that this is a youth who potentially has been now separated from his family for the first time? Is this the first time that the youth has been in the detention center? Is it completely typical and expected that they're going to be depressed or angry or apprehensive or closed off to your questioning? Or is the person who's making the decision as to the diagnosis taking those responses personally and then applying a label to them, which then results in overmedication or a misdiagnosis? So one example of also this halo effect, which is discounting other more reasonable explanations as to the behavior, they reference a pocket of research which was related to ADHD diagnosis. And they were looking at children that were in kindergarten, that were born really close to the cutoff dates for kindergarten. And what they saw is that when they looked at those youth as compared to youth that were just born a couple days later and then would have been on the other side of the school cutoff, that they saw that they were diagnosed somewhere between 30 and 60 times. They were more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD and then also given medication to treat that ADHD. But what they also found was that the doctors were discounting the fact that those youth were relatively much younger and less mature than other people in their class because they fell on one side of the school cutoff date for kindergarten as opposed to the other. So what does this mean in numbers? This would mean that 1.1 million children received an inappropriate diagnosis and that over 800,000 received stimulant medication due only to relative immaturity. So these are the types of ways that this filters in to these settings. And so we're going to talk about those a little bit more, right? So it's not only that we have situations in which There's implicit bias among healthcare professionals that influence the diagnosis and the treatment decisions, what we see and what the research, and it's going to be, as that is available to you in the practical guide, I promise you, is that you see that Black patients are overdiagnosed for things like schizophrenia and underdiagnosed for depression and anxiety. And Hedgie walked us through the ADHD OCD divide as well. Where's the information coming from as to how our clients are doing on medication, how our clients are behaving? Many times it's coming from school settings. And what we see and what we know is that IRB also filters into adults being able to accurately assess whether or not children are angry, children are sad, right? And being able to recognize emotions on children's faces. This was also a study which was about emotion recognition and the accuracy of anger bias when looking at photos of children and trying to determine whether or not they were angry or sad or disappointed. And what they found is that both Black girls and Black boys were inaccurately seen as angry more often than their white counterparts. So we just have to think about that when we think about our clients walking into a provider's office and how they're interpreting behavior and how they're interpreting reactions. So it starts as early as preschool. So this is another indication as potentially why we see garbage in diagnosis when things are coming from a school setting.
There's a new study out of the Yale Child Study Center that I had to read a few times just to believe what it was telling me. The researchers recruited about 135 preschool teachers. They had them watch video footage of 4 kids playing, a Black boy, a Black girl, a white boy, and a white girl. And they told the teachers, their subjects, watch the video, there may be some challenging behaviors. As soon as you see something that could become challenging, hit the enter key on your keypad. Well, here's the trick. There was no challenging behavior. The researchers were using eye scan technology to see which child the teachers were looking at the most. And what they found is that the teachers, both white and Black alike, spent the most time watching the Black boy, waiting for bad behavior that never came. There's one more really interesting headline in this study, which comes later. The teachers were also given a 1-paragraph description to read of a hypothetical child with a stereotypical name who behaves pretty badly in class, pushes, scratches, throws toys. And some of the teachers were also given some biographical information that helped make sense of that behavior. They were told that the child lives with his mother, father has been in and out for years, they're relatively poor, the mother is depressed, works 3 jobs. The researchers wanted to know if knowing this information made the teachers more empathetic to the kid. Well, here's the shock. It did, but only if the teacher and the child were of the same race. If the teacher and the child, a white teacher and a Black child, or even a Black teacher and a white child, knowing that biographical information, those teachers were less empathetic towards those students. And here's why this matters. Imagine if this is true, if there's this empathy deficit in preschool, well, imagine where else that's true.
So we don't have to imagine where else this is true, right? We know, we're in the courtroom, we know where else this is true. But what all the research also talks about teachers and their reactions to perceived behavior or discipline issues as well. So we've now talked about whether or not they're over surveilling Black boys as early as preschool, whether or not their IRB is impacting being able to determine emotions on their face, but also how they react in school discipline also has been studied. And again, the link is there and it's in the practice guide, but these were actually 2 separate studies and they looked at how teachers reacted to incident reports. And basically across the board, whether the teacher believed that the student was Black or white, the reaction to the first bit of misbehavior was the same. But for Black children, the second instance of misbehavior was met with harsher discipline reactions by the teachers. Additionally, in the second part of the study, which is linked, they talk about the fact that the teachers were more likely to indicate that indicated a pattern of misbehavior, and that would impact whether or not they would recommend suspensions for that student going down the line. So we start thinking about when your client has an assessment done, how much the provider is relying on school records, or how they're performing in school, or how their parent is reporting, or the foster care parent is reporting as to how they're doing at home. So this gives us a little bit of a peek into how overmedication and misdiagnosis begins to occur, particularly for children. What we also see, and what Dr. Irwin talked about during his presentation, is the wealth gap impacts what type of services people and diagnoses that people get as well. And then there's also the impact of access to insurance. And so what Dr. Irwin talked about is that there's a lack of affordable care, and the racial disparities and uninsured rates remain, with uninsured rates higher among states that refuse to participate in the Affordable Care Act's Medicare expansion. And what we also see is that there's an uninsured rate of Black communities at 11% compared to 8% for white communities, and that gap has continued to increase. We look at numbers from 2019 with approximately 4.4 million children who did not have health insurance, and that was an increase from the year prior of 320,000 children. What we also know is that children that are on Medicaid are 5 times more likely to be diagnosed with a disruptive behavior disorder compared to children that are on prior insurance. And what Dr. Irwin walked us through is the fact that as you dig down even deeper, the disparities increase. Kids on private insurance are medicated way less than kids on Medicaid. Disparities in Medicaid and private insurance among the rate of patients being medicated, that poor kids and minority kids are medicated more than white kids from white families with private insurance. And that even within the world of Medicaid, children in foster care and in the juvenile system, where the state plays a role in decision-making, are medicated way more than kids on Medicaid. And that with each cut, you get more and more children, Black and brown children, that are involved in that process. What we also talked about on the 10th was that the amount of medication that kids in foster care received was also beyond orders that were necessitated. And that in response to a question, Dr. Irwin also reminded us that kids that are in foster care, that the foster parents actually will receive more money for children that are on medications while in the foster care system. So these are all things that we need to be hyper aware about. And now we're going to get into how we use all this information in court.
Yes. Okay. So now let's dive in, as KK said, on litigation strategies, on how to fight these over-medication or misdiagnoses issues that come in court. And for this session, we are going to be focusing specifically on conditions that mandate medication, and particularly antipsychotic medication. So our legal hook for this is based on the fundamental due process right to refuse antipsychotic medication. Now, the US Supreme Court has recognized on numerous occasions that all individuals, including those who are detained and committed, they have a substantial liberty interest to be free from unwanted antipsychotic medication. And this due process right is premised on the fact that, one, antipsychotic drugs are designed to change your brain chemistry, which, if unwanted, would substantially interfere with a person's autonomy. And two, that antipsychotic drugs are associated with known serious side effects. So courts have actually analogized the use of antipsychotics to the physical restraint on a person's body by essentially couching antipsychotics as a mental restraint that triggers a substantial liberty interest, just as a physical restraint on a person's body would. And this signifies the degree of restraint and control that antipsychotics pose on a person's autonomy and bodily integrity if it's unwanted. In fact, even medically, antipsychotics are often referred to as chemical restraints in the hospital setting. So now that we've identified that this protected liberty interest to be free from unwanted antipsychotics exists, now we can examine what types of procedural protections are triggered by the unwanted imposition of antipsychotics. And the Supreme Court has indicated that these procedural protections, it depends on the governmental interest that's at stake. So if the government is seeking to forcibly medicate an individual due to a dangerousness calculation, then the government has to, then there has to be a finding that the treatment was medically appropriate and that the treatment was essential for the safety of that individual or others considering less intrusive alternatives. But if an individual's dangerousness was not at stake, then the Supreme Court requires more stringent due process requirements, which this is really what we're going to be looking at for medication conditions that we often see in probation, for example. So this case is based on a US Supreme Court case called Cell v. US, and it pertained to the involuntary medication of an individual to render them competent to stand trial. And the court held that there must be a legal finding that one, the medication was necessary to further an important governmental interest. Two, that the side effects wouldn't render the trial unfair, such as by interfering with the individual's ability to assist counsel during trial. Three, that the medication was least restrictive considering all alternatives, and four, that the medication was in the client's best medical interest in light of the individual's medical condition. So what all of this means for us in the juvenile legal system is that we have an opening. We have an opening to argue against court orders mandating medication, especially when it implicates antipsychotic medication that our clients do not wish to take or continue to take. So first and foremost, the legal argument would be that a court order mandating medication, particularly antipsychotic medication, under the threat of incarceration is akin to the forcible administration of medication. Now, this gets us access to the specific procedural due process requirements that we just covered under the Harper, Riggins, and Cell line of precedent. Now, what this then means once we trigger that substantial liberty interest is that we then have a right to a hearing where the state would have to prove that the medication condition is necessary to achieve the state's interest. So, as an example, in the dispositional phase, the state would have to prove that the medication condition is necessary to achieve the goals of probation if probation was ordered at disposition and there was a medication condition as part of probation. This would be a higher standard than what we typically see in the probation space, right? It usually conditions pass muster so long as they're reasonably related to the goals of probation. So this would afford us access to a higher, more stringent requirement. And second, the state would have to prove that the medication condition is the least restrictive and least intrusive on our client's liberty interest. Now, this part of this inquiry can be an opening for us as defenders to inquire whether psychotherapy was considered as an alternative. Why or why not? And to what extent was psychotherapy explored, right? Because psychotherapy, if we're looking at the ODD framework, is the first line of treatment for ODD as an example. So theoretically, that would be considered the least intrusive for our clients before an antipsychotic is ordered. And the good news of all of this is that the Ninth Circuit actually upheld exactly this frame of reasoning in a case pertaining to a supervised release condition. So the Ninth Circuit found that before a mandatory medication condition is imposed at sentencing, the trial court must make a medically grounded finding that the medication condition was necessary to achieve the goals of supervised release and that there were no reasonable alternatives that were less restrictive. So this is a really huge opening for us as defenders to begin to assert and utilize in court on behalf of our clients. So to equip you with the tools to effectuate this argument in practice, this is our framework for incorporating research, data, history into a legal argument. And I'm sure many of you have seen this framework. It's part of our White App series, and we use it frequently. But to apply this in the medication condition context, first, of course, you start with the defense theory, right? And as an example, just to sum up what we covered today, the defense theory could be that the conditions that mandate antipsychotic medication violate the 14th Amendment because all individuals have a fundamental due process right to be free from unwanted and arbitrary imposition of antipsychotic medication, and that the clinical labeling of Black youth with disruptive behaviors and the subsequent use of antipsychotic medication as a form of social control is rooted in our country's history of structural racism that has shaped racial disparities and provider biases that infiltrate our healthcare system today, or something along those lines, right? Then you cite to relevant law. You can start with the liberty interest. You can start with Harper, Riggins, and Sell, that line of cases. Then you cite to relevant state constitutional law. Check your state constitution to see if you have more protective protections under your state constitution, and then state statutes, state's case law based on the stage of proceeding that you're in. Then you add in all the relevant data, research, and history that we covered today, right? That ties in a lot of what KK was talking about IRB and misdiagnosis, IRB and educators, and really tying in and shaping the narrative of the racialization around misdiagnoses and overmedication that affect Black, Latino, Latina, Native, Indigenous youth. And then you tie in all the research, data, and history with the facts and law of your case, and voila. But of course, we recognize, right, that this is so much easier said than done. And we also recognize that, frankly, this is going to probably take multiple attempts before a jurist before you even get the hearing, arguably, right? So we want to remind everyone that you are not alone in this fight. You have a community of defenders and advocates on your side, and that you can utilize as resources as we embark on this new argument that we can be raising in our court systems. And to that end, I know KK's alluded to this, but we leave you with some gifts that we'll email you after our training. This includes a bulleted guide that can be used as a cheat sheet for either motion practice or oral advocacy whenever you see these issues come up. It lays out all the arguments that we just covered based on the structure from the slide before. And the purpose of this document is that you can pull out any relevant law or research or history that are all fully cited in whatever way makes sense for your case. So think of it as a buffet of arguments that you can pull from to best suit your legal case. We also have an interview guide. And it comes with a set of clinical red flags. So these are directly lifted from Dr. Irwin's handout that he gave us on April 10th. I know Amy put it in the chat as well. But this is just so before you go into an interview, you have these in your mind that then can inform your interview questions. And of course, we then have a list of sample interview questions to ask your client, to ask a parent, caretaker, guardian, and also we have some for providers as well. And these are all just to help guide an issue spot when overmedication or misdiagnoses or the unwanted use of antipsychotics may be implicated for you to try to start using some of these arguments that we talked about. And lastly, hopefully many of you are already aware of this, but our online racial justice toolkit, which has an additional plethora of resources, studies, sample briefs, annotated bibliographies, all for your use. If you try something out, email us so we can update this toolkit. It's a living resource. So we encourage you to continue to utilize it. And with the time remaining, I know we promised you under an hour. I think we're going to make it because now we're opening it up for question and answer. And Dr. Irwin is here. He is willing to answer any questions that you may have as a follow-up to his training or hopefully as a follow-up to our training, if he's willing to answer those questions as well. And KK and I are here as well. So thank you for your time and attention. We'd be happy to open it up to questions if you guys have any questions. Let me close out of this so I can see everyone. Okay, so we got a question on why Indigenous Native youth are over medicated. So, to be honest, in our research, a lot of the primary studies that we looked at that examined these diagnostic disparities actually only focused on Black and Latina youth. And it's not to say that there isn't research on Native Indigenous youth. I just think it's relatively less studied than Black and Latina youth. And the reason why we reference Black, Latina, Native Indigenous youth in general is because we know from federal data that those three client populations are most overrepresented in the juvenile court system. And there's so many different causes for that, right? So I think that in terms of examining why that is the case, it definitely requires a look at what the structural roots that impact Native Indigenous youth particularly are. And there is a whole strain of that as well. We just haven't necessarily covered it in this training. Not to say that the issue doesn't exist, of course. Any other questions? Any other questions for Dr. Irwin while we have him?
Dr. Irwin, I'll ask, have you seen lawyers litigating in some of the ways that KK and Hedgie are sharing with us today?
Yes, but not as often as I think I would like or you would like. There are some attorneys who really are aggressive in litigating over medication of kids, both in foster care and juvenile justice. But most attorneys shy away from it because it's an uneven playing field. They don't have the resource. First, they don't have the resources to do it, but even if they could mount the case, judges tend to be fairly dismissive on, obviously there are exceptions, because the state or the Department of Social Service or the juvenile justice representative of the foster care agency, they're bringing some sort of report, even if it's a lousy report, with a signature on the bottom saying the kid must be on medicine. So when the attorney says, I read somewhere that the medicine is dangerous, or the parent is objecting to the medicine, the judge sort of says, that's nice, but who cares? I have a report in front of me. So I think until states are willing to pay for second opinions, or some advocacy groups do have some limited funding for second opinions. It's such an uneven playing field that although this should be done, it's not done nearly as much as needed to give the message that kids shouldn't be over-medicated, which would take a few decisions in similar courts and similar jurisdictions until DSS or OCFS or whatever the nice name is in whatever jurisdiction you are gets the message.
So, Dr. Irwin, one thing that we've heard suggested is that even if you don't have the money to do a full new evaluation, that potentially you could even ask or retain an expert to do a records review. And I know that you've also offered to review records to determine whether or not this kind of rises to the level of a red flag that potentially.
Yeah,
would
but that's the
warrant-
thing. Most states don't have, or advocacy groups. That's part of consultation money. It doesn't have, right. The first step is, and it is cheaper because it just takes less time, but it is a full record review, and then writing a report based on that record review that the medicines are, not called for. Again, there are some. I was just, recently on a case, I can't mention which state, where an individual kid, sued once he was a young adult and got the and the lawyers paid for the to hire an expert, and it was, this kid, the state clearly was saying for months and months that they would never ever settle, and then they read the report and they settled. And it's not even clear to me that the state broke one of their regulations, but juries wouldn't, no jury really hearing and understanding this kid's case history would have any sympathy for the state, even if they say, nothing else was available.
Gotcha. So there's a question in the chat that says, do you foresee further disparities in ADHD diagnosis due to the DEA's production limit on Adderall?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part.
Do you foresee further disparities in ADHD diagnosis due to the DEA's production limit on Adderall?
I don't know exactly how to answer that. Not in the ADHD diagnosis, but in what I'm worried about, but that's already what happened, and I caught the last 5 minutes of the presentation, so I don't know how much that was distinguished. What worries me most is that these kids, and that's so much more true for kids from any minority group, are going to be put on antipsychotic medication where the benefits are almost nil and the risks and costs and side effects are super high. Stimulants, at least, whether they're used fairly or not, are relatively safe, and the benefits really, for many kids, do outweigh the risks. But as it is, and we know for sure about the Black kids, they're so disproportionately put on antipsychotics. So in as much as stimulants become unavailable, there'll be more of a use of antipsychotics, which again are no proven benefit other than for real schizophrenia or true bipolar disorder, no benefits and huge risks.
I also see someone has their hand up. Is it Lee? Yes.
Just a quick question. When attorneys raise competency for a client, is it possible that that they could raise not necessarily competency, but like it would be akin to raising competency for an assessment on medication? Does that make sense? Do you know what I mean? So
As
when you
in,
were talking about having the resources and the judges get a report from a doctor that says they need to go on this medication, could an attorney raise something akin to competency to have an assessment done as to whether that is the correct medication, as opposed to just asking to, do you know what I mean?
So I think I understand where you're going. You're saying, is that an avenue where you'd be able to basically get an expert evaluation done
Right.
on medication?
Right.
I haven't seen it done. I don't know if anybody else on the call has tried that. I think that is exactly the type of thing we would want to come out of a conversation like today, is some of these like thoughts about where we're going to raise it, how we're going to raise it, how we're going to get it before the court.
Right.
Hedgie, what are your thoughts?
So and not to say that it wouldn't work, but I will say that there is some case law that distinguishes competency to stand trial with the competency around refusing medication or even like the need for medication, right? And I think it's good case law because it recognizes that development and cognitive functioning like affect different areas, right? So someone theoretically could be incompetent to stand trial, but still competent enough to refuse medication.
Right.
So I think that so long as those lines are clear, really whatever avenue we can use to get, I think it really depends on like where your state money comes from to get
Right.
that expert assessment. If it's through your competency hearing without conflating the two issues, that's great. Right. If it comes through a different avenue, I think it's just working with whatever state policies you have in place and like whatever office policies you have in place for your expert too.
Right.
And that kind of like, yeah, but before I go in, did that answer your question?
So yeah, pretty much. I mean, I'm not saying competent, I'm using it as, I don't know what else,
Right.
what other term to use. I'm using, when you raise competency as the example, having it be akin to raising competency, because I definitely know that you definitely don't want to conflate those two and the differences, but that definitely sort of leans towards answering the question. So thank you.
And I think it's, I think we're
Yeah.
in pretty uncharted territory.
Mhm.
So we are very curious to hear how it goes and to hear people's thoughts and opinions as you litigate these issues, or if you've already tried to litigate these issues and how we can troubleshoot from there as well. And I saw that there's one more question on reconciling IRB and diagnosis. And so in a perfect world, I think that comes down to getting different opinions and finding a psychiatrist that you trust, and a psychiatrist or a psychologist that when you do that like 1 hour record review that KK was talking about, you can kind of suss out like where that person will be going. Because it's not to say, so we know from studies that providers have IRB just like we do, but just like we do, like we can be aware of our IRB and then put that into practice of affirmatively trying to keep our IRBs in check. So I think it's the same exact thing of finding the people who have aligned values in that regard. And that process, I think it comes from, you could use our listservs to see if people have psychiatrists or psychologists or experts that they've worked with that they trust. It could be through trying to get a series of different opinions by those record requests, like the cursory record requests as well. And relying on what other people,
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Dr. Hiscox talked about when we were consulting him about today's training, and that was someone separate than Dr. Irwin, but I'm interested to hear what Dr. Irwin has to say about it, is that Dr. Hiscox had said, when you read a report, if it contains a lot of descriptions of your client that are assessments like he was angry or hostile, and that might be sort of a red flag that someone's relying more on IRB and not talking about like actual behavior, but making a judgment or making a decision about aspects of the client. And so he said, whenever you read a report and it says, as opposed to someone not answering the question, that they were hostile or that they're aggressive or that they're angry, any of these like conclusory like language, that is a potential red flag and something that you need to be like considering how the doctor is interpreting the behavior, how the clinician is interpreting the behavior, that they're then giving a diagnosis and potentially attempting to medicate.
I would add to that, or maybe put a drop of a different slant to it. My puppy doesn't like when I talk on Zoom. I think most of you, or actually all of you, really, could do that if you had the time. First, a good report has at least a third of the report is the discussion. Regurgitating, my reports are even less, and that's because, I don't regurgitate all the facts that everybody knows. If everybody knows them, there's no purpose in doing that. So there really should be a discussion that convinces you that the diagnosis is correct. So I might write in a report, I do have a line because you have to have it, that says diagnosis. But right after that, I have my discussion section, which is by far the longest in my report, where I justify the diagnosis. So if it's depression, I talk about how what the depressive symptoms are. So then, or what the ADHD symptoms are, or why, and then I talk about why I don't think it's certain things. Why this isn't bipolar disorder, why I think it's an angry behavior. So you really want a discussion section. Then you want to see that the symptoms, all the reports will have a label. You could go online easily and look up the criteria for that label. And then if, the label, if you can't find the symptoms that are necessary for the diagnosis in the report to prove that label is reasonable, then you have something you could show the judge. This is ADHD. Here are the ADHD symptoms from DSM-5, and none of these are reported. And I've seen that. I've seen kids with, behavior problems, they hate being in foster care, diagnosed as ADHD, and there's not one mention in the report that they can't focus. So again, you could reconcile the label with the symptoms by going online and looking up the DSM criteria. Second is anger is not a diagnosis. That's not a reason to, or even specific behaviors that's separate from symptoms. Fighting, there is no medicine for fighting. Now, if the fighting is caused by ADHD because you're impulsive, you could maybe help the fighting by reducing the ADHD symptoms. If the emotional dysregulation, again, if that's part of depression, treating the depression might help the emotional dysregulation. But if you really see they're treating anger, there is no treatment for anger. So then they're treating behaviors that they don't like that isn't a psychiatric diagnosis. So again, I've seen huge numbers of reports where kids are given a label to justify the medicine, but all that there is in the report is anger and behaviors that even when the behaviors are specified, they're not psychiatric symptoms, they're behaviors adults don't like. For good reason, but that's not a reason to medicate.
Thank you for that. Any other questions before we wrap up for today? Okay, well, Dr. Irwin has given out his phone number, and it's in the handout. You know where to find Hedgie and I. Thank you so much for coming today.
Do the email address as much. The best way to contact me is through the NYU email address, and then we'll arrange for a time to talk. But again, that's just a brief, informal consultation where I will tell you you'll describe something and I'll tell you what I think.
I love that. Thank you for that. And thank you all for coming. Have a great afternoon.